Hello, I'm Juliet Mann, and this is the Agenda podcast, CGTN Europe's one-stop shop for smart, in-depth discussion of the issues that really matter in the world today. This week, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and President of the European Council, Charles Michel, headed to Beijing for their first face-to-face meeting with President Xi in 4 years. So where do we stand following the summit, and what does it all mean for global trade? Well, joining me now from Beijing is Wang, founder and president of the Centre for China and Globalization. In Brussels, Ambassador Piet, the chair of the Europe-Asia Centre, and from the University of Bradford, Monnet Professor Jean-Marc Trouille. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. I'm going to start with you, Jean-Marc. Now, China's Foreign Minister Wang said earlier in the week that this meeting was a chance to push China-EU relations to a new level with new prospects. Has this summit achieved that?
Yes, well, this summit that took place in Beijing was the 24th EU-China summit. So there is a long history of communication between the two blocs, between the EU and China. However, this time the EU leaders actually who were present at the table were representing a different bloc than before. Because you've had the pandemic, you've had the invasion of Ukraine, you've had a lot of changes at geopolitical level in the world. And the EU is changing, the EU is adapting, sometimes reluctantly, but it has become much more reactive than it was before. And in 2019, when Ursula von der Leyen took office, she announced that her commission would be a geopolitical commission. This at first, was met with skepticism, not least on the side of Beijing. But it is a fact that von der Leyen has actually transformed the commission. It's no longer a bureaucratic secretariat implementing the will of European national leaders. But it is now more a major macroeconomic actor, geoeconomic actor.
So you're talking about that change of mindset then from the European Union, but sometimes there are hints that perhaps they are overstepping. I mean, after the meeting with Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel, President Xi said that Europe must eliminate all kinds of interference that exist within their relationship and should not view China as a rival. Ambassador, do you think that's going to happen?
Yes, I also saw these comments from President Xi Jinping. Of course, it all depends on how do you find rival and how do you find, this relationship. My experience is that even between good friends, there can be kind of competition and rivalry, and particularly on trade matters. As far as interference is concerned, I think it's good, the interference again. I don't see interference in any way in the discussions. I don't see it as an interference. There was a candid discussion. That means people were really talking openly and very candidly. And I think this is very important in any dialogue you have. And I think the dialogue at the moment between China and the EU is one of the most important dialogues, in the world. I mean, together with the EU and the US. So I think we have to talk about in an open spirit, transparent manner. And I think there is no place here of talking about interference as such, and I don't see it as such. So.
And Ursula von der Leyen said these talks were intense. But Huiyao, let's talk about what President Xi described as the relationship being really important for global peace, that relationship between China and Europe. Global peace, stability, prosperity. So what, if anything, do you think has emerged from this meeting that will cement that?
Absolutely. I think that, this is the first time, 4 years, physically, the top leaders of EU and top leaders of China, both president and premier, met in Beijing. And this is very significant. It also shows China opening up. And also remember, this is also the 2 or 3 weeks to follow up the summit between President Xi and President Biden. I think, the world, as I agree with the opening remark, the world has greatly changed since 4 years ago. But it's now more realized now. The world is getting more dangerous. There's more conflict. There's more war going on. And then EU is really caught in between now. And then China, as one of the emerging global power, has really can play more active, constructive role. For example, China has secured a deal for Iran and Saudi, early this year. And of course, China has set up an envoy to mediate between Russian war in Ukraine, but also Palestinian and Israel conflict. So I think more than ever, EU sees China's increasingly important role. And I think I'm glad to see the outcome of these meetings that both realize we cannot decouple. They all emphasize we cannot decouple. And both realize we are really ideal partners in many fronts, collaborate, including trade and economy. We have to increase the balance of that as well. So what I interpret of this high-level summit is very constructive. It is very timely, and it's really built up the consensus that China and the EU are strong supporters of multilateralism, of also against the conflict in either in Europe or Middle East, and also EU sees the increasing important role China played in leading the global South, and I think also in President Xi also mentioned that Belt and Road Summit of China, but also EU's global gateway can work together. For the global South.
President Xi talked about that mutual cooperation. I'm wondering where we might be seeing that in practice. Is it likely to be mainly around the green transition or elsewhere?
I think the translation into practice is very important, and the best signals I think we will hear, maybe not, but in the coming days and coming weeks, is how the business operators will interpret, this kind of statements. That's very important because they will decide how they will implement their strategies, in Europe, Chinese companies in Europe or European companies in China. That's how I see it. Now, I think we have to build on this summit, and I'm very happy to see that there are some new initiatives. There will be more cooperation and more talk and dialogue on finance, and on the economy. In as far as my organization is concerned, which is the Europe-Asia Center, we are very much interested in what we call people-to-people exchanges, and the dialogue will be resumed between China and the EU on people-to-people exchange. So we really look forward to what it means in the field, on the spot, how it will be translated into action.
Well, we're talking about convergences, but there are also divergences. After the meeting, Ursula von der Leyen spoke about the clear imbalances and differences in trade in particular. Jean-Marc, what exactly do you think she was talking about, and how likely is it that the EU will get what it sees as a better balance?
Right. It's a geopolitical commission, as Ursula von der Leyen described it when she arrived. So she really wants to make the EU an actor in its own right, and she tried to be reasonably forceful in this meeting about the need for more, for more balanced relationship. This systemic rivalness that used to be, the criterion on the way that China was described in the EU is no longer mentioned as such, because the relation is far too important in order to be openly conflictual, and that's what both sides want to avoid.
Juliet, I want to pick up on something that you mentioned earlier, and how the language has changed, moving from decoupling to de-risking, because that's something that the EU began, that push to de-risk the bloc supply chains from China and to secure critical technologies. What do you think it's going to take to change that?
Well, I think that certainly EU is strongly against the decoupling, which is a step in the right direction. But also you mentioned about the risk, but also we have to really clarify what the risk means. If it's the risk from China, that doesn't make sense at all. But if we're talking about the risk from climate change or the risk from pandemic, the risk from AI's future threat, that's fine. So we have to really mention that when Jan Yellen, you know, the Treasury Secretary of the U.S. come to China, didn't even talk about the risk, should talk about diversification. So if we actually interpret that as a diversification, that's fine. That's a common knowledge. That's a common sense. Every business does that. We don't have to emphasize the risk. So if not really talk about the risk with China, that'd be fine. So I mean, everybody does diversify, you know, people take a risk and you know, calculations all the time. So we don't really have to. Government doesn't have to recognize that. If you really talk about the risk, you know, decouple or rivalry, just like you are flashing the red lights, green lights, and the yellow lights all at the same time. It sends a very confused signal to the business community what to do, where to go. So I think we have to be really clarifying that. I mean, the risk is only a very small part of that, but majority of that is cooperative.
If I may add some, you know, on de-risking, indeed, I mean, it's all in, you know, the word is probably a little bit, you know, it's probably not the best chosen word in international diplomacy. It's more probably, you know, you find it in business, more, you know, risk analysis and all that. But de-risking for me means, you know, to become less dependent, you know, in some strategic areas of the economy. And I think this is also applied by, you know, de-risking. You see it in all countries. I mean, Europe has been a very open economy, has been a very open trading partner. So I believe that in a way, de-risking is not a danger as such. If you look at it, I mean, if you look at the whole relationship, the economic and trade relationship between China and the EU, about 95% is not about de-risking. De-risking is a very, you know, minute part of our relationship. It's important, and I think this is kind of, you know, in Europe, we have indeed, as it was already mentioned in the beginning, probably are less naive than 5 years or 10 years ago. We try to live in a world, I mean, and to understand that world, how it is. Our economy, our industries depend on certain very strategic materials, and particularly for the future industry, which is much more based on IT and artificial intelligence. I mean, this is a very new kind of, it's a game changer. And I think we have to look at it in a very realistic way. And of course, we need to have this dialogue with, you know, with our partners like China, on this matter. I mean, we don't hide it, you know, let's face it, but don't see it as something which is gonna, you know, overshadow our relationship as such.
Jean-Marc, something that China has pushed back on is what the EU is doing around electric vehicles. I mean, China is the world leader, they say, through innovation, free competition, and a complete industrial supply chain, and says the EU's investigation into China's state support for makers of electric vehicles is protectionist practice. What's your take on that?
Well, China is an extremely important partner in terms of the market. It is the largest market on earth for electric vehicles now. And China is also very much involved in controlling as much as it can the resources that are needed for electric batteries. So it is very important to cooperate closely with China, whilst at the same time, I think, trying to work towards this autonomy in terms of supply, because this strategic. This path to strategic autonomy is actually a difficult one, it is a challenging one, especially with big players such as the US and China. But it is actually noticeable that some big companies like Volkswagen, like the big car manufacturers, players in Europe actually continue to invest, and sometimes very large sums, in China, despite the fact that post-pandemic there's been a trend towards disinvesting in China and investing in countries that are considered as geopolitically safer from the perspective of investors. And that's, I think, one of the main lessons of this meeting. There was a spirit of openness, where each party was prepared to, listen to the others. That's ever so important in a world that is becoming even more dangerous.
Let's face it, though, China remains the EU's major trading partner, doesn't it, Juliet? I mean, how far do you think that this meeting went towards making things perhaps less confrontational, especially over the high-tech sector?
Well, it's absolutely. I think, we haven't heard too much mention about this subsidy issue in this conference, because it's a double-edged sword, because the Euro automakers are in China. They are really developed a state-of-the-art EV cars here in China. They have the best R&D center in China. So the China center, the China largest production base in China, supply those European automakers throughout the world. So if they have to be cutting edge, if they have to be most competitive, they have to be in China, because that's where all the transformation has been taking place now for decades. So they are really, here's the testing ground, here's the R&D center, here's the best product produced for your auto workers. So if EU started this investigation of subsidy issues, it's really controversial, and then it may lead to a trade friction or even trade war. So I don't think the European automakers can bear that. And then also they're going to slow down gradually, significantly, climate peak or climate neutral objectives of both EU and China. So it doesn't really, it's counterproductive. So I think I'm glad to see that it was not really mentioned much this time.
I do wonder, though, Piet, how much you think that the EU speaks with one voice on China.
Of course, the EU is 27 countries, and they meet on a regular basis in Brussels at the highest level. Heads of state, heads of government. It's chaired by Charles Michel, and what I want to say, of course, is that you have to find a consensus among 27, which is not always easy. And every country, in the EU. EU is not a federal state as such. EU is as what I would call an ad hoc structure, which was built over the years. Started in the 50s. So we are now 27, and it's not always easy to. But we speak with one voice. We speak with one voice on trade, for instance. Trade. How important trade is, and it's the European Commission as such. Which negotiates, trade matters with other countries, and particularly on China. Now, on the matter of on anti-subsidies investigations, I mean, this is part of what I would call an adult relationship. It's a mature relationship already, between China and the EU. And I remember I spent some time in Geneva. As a diplomat, particularly with the GATT and the WTO afterwards, and I remember the EU and the US, they had always conflicts on specific matters. I remember we had years of discussions and negotiations on subsidies on Airbus and on Boeing. I mean, this is part of your, a very mature relationship. And that is what is happening today as well. I mean, of course, you can always interpret, certain measures from a specific political angle, but I don't see it. I see it as a very mature relationship in trade. And of course, there are ups and downs. And we are there together find and manage, to find solutions and manage the situation.
I want to push you further on that, Ambassador. You talk about the relationship between the US and China, and I wonder how far the EU is governed by what's happening with that relationship, because the mood after President Xi's meeting with President Biden last month did seem to be quite warm. I wonder if you think that the relationship between China and the EU is heading along the same path, and if they maybe take their cues from what's happening on the other side of the Atlantic.
Yeah, on the meeting between President Biden and President Xi Jinping, I think indeed it was. I felt kind of a relief. I mean, finally, I mean they seem to have a better understanding, and there is also a personal relationship between Xi Jinping and President Biden, which goes back for a very long time. Of course, with the EU, I was not present in Beijing, but as what I see from the media and the different releases, press releases I saw, I think it went very well. And of course, we are still not in a position, EU and the US, you have a US president. I mean, Europe is still in the making, as you know. This is a long process, and we made great strides in becoming a big power as EU as such. And it was mentioned, it's a geopolitical commission at the moment. So I think comparing with China-US relationship, I think we have to go our own way. Europe has to find its own way between the US and China. And I think what I see is we do it. And I think we are also confronted in Europe. We are confronted in Europe with a war, which is actually pushing us to, bringing us more together. And I think that's why in what I see from the discussions, very open discussions, that all the subjects which might be of concern to Europe were raised, and also from the Chinese side. So I think I found this summit certainly a very good step in the right direction for a greater cooperation with China and the EU.
Let's talk about what is going to happen next. Jean-Marc, over to you. Where do you see China-EU relations heading in 2024?
I think there are lots of areas where China and the EU could cooperate. And one of them is perhaps one that should be, raised more often. This would be cooperation in Africa, where both China and the EU are very involved. So the African continent is facing huge challenges, not least in terms of food supply because of the invasion of Ukraine, but also in terms of the demographic explosion that it has to face. It has to create 20 to 25 million new jobs a year on a continent that has now the population of China, the equivalent population. So big challenges there, and the EU and China could actually make efforts to jointly cooperate closely with Africa and with the African Union in order to launch a trilateral cooperation that would be beneficial to the future division of labor, of the future position of Africa in the International Division of Labor. So there would be lots of benefits where, instead of seeing Africa as a battleground, seeing Africa as an area where cooperation can be intensified, where both China and the EU can be, sometimes competitors, but also sometimes in close cooperation. That would be beneficial for all parties involved.
Juliet, what's your outlook for EU-China relations in 2024?
Well, I think this is really a very good new start. After COVID, post-COVID, Sino-EU relations come back a bit to the normalcy, at least to the people-to-people exchange. We'll see the next year, 60 years anniversary of China-French diplomatic ties. There will be a cultural year between China and France, and tourism year. And also we see, of course, love to see this. China just recently, voluntarily, unilaterally lifted the visa restriction for top 5 EU countries. So we're going to see more European tourists coming to China. And also I hope that, this the comprehensive agreement on investment between China and the EU should be really, real to be realized. I mean, China could probably, I would, like to see China probably unilaterally lift, some these restrictions. But of course, we should leave the restriction on both sides. But China could apply unilaterally this agreement to some, Belt and Road country like Hungary, like Greek, and other Greece and other European countries. But really can apply that to the highest openness from China. But also, I think, furthermore, I see EU and China are strong defenders of multilateralism. I mean, we're getting the multipolar world, like Olaf Scholz just said. Unipolar is gone, and multipolar is here. So let's work together. Great. China can work with you on Africa, can work on the Belt and Road, EU Global Gateway, even B3W. So let's really find a ways to work together. Climate change is a big thing as well. And AI, digital, climate, pandemic, outer space, all those great things, EU and China should work together. And also, finally, I think EU could do something to mediate between China and the US. Try to be a peacemaker rather than follow completely or largely with one-sided. Let's really be a neutral, strategic, independent. Yeah. But also, China and the EU can work together on the Russian-Ukraine crisis, the Russian war in Ukraine, but also this Palestine-Israel conflict. And China and EU can work together at the UN and safeguard the UN Charter, and all those good things. So there's many things that China and EU can work together. So this is a good start. Let's hope for the best next year.
Wang Yao, Piet Steele, and Jean-Marc Trouille, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find more agenda content on CGTN Europe's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram, and YouTube channels. Until next time, goodbye.
The most interesting questions.
Are there other living beings beyond Earth?
Will man or machine be in charge?
Great question.
Always have more than one answer.
Well, hold on, let me just draw up a list.
And always come from more than one person.
That's where the credibility lies.
The concept of having a machinery which is alive and evolving didn't wait for us.
The end of inequality of incomes and wealth around the world, can you imagine how difficult that is at the moment to achieve?
Every episode, Stephen Cole, Murray Beveridge, and some of the brightest minds out there shed light on the answers to some of the most intriguing questions.
There are two ways of looking at this.
Machines can't really discriminate between civilian and military targets.
The Answers Project.
Maybe we need to just look at this in a bit more detail.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The Answers Project, a new podcast from CGTN Europe.